Hello friends, in the last session we discussed the evolution of the practice of colonialism in India and how India became a colony gradually starting with the year 1600 and it remained a colony till 1947. Now we are going to discuss how colonialism led to economic exploitation of India. So the first impact that was seen was on the Indian handicrafts. Till the time Britishers came to India, India was having a very well-functioning handicraft industry. There were so many artisans who used to work in these industries. There were small industries, small cottage industries, and they used to work well. And we have discussed also that around 1600 and 1500, 1600, India had a share of almost 25% of the world trade. However, in the next 300, 350 years of colonial rule, India's share reduced to just around 1%. So that was the extent of economic exploitation of India under the British rule as a British colony. And as far as the Indian handicrafts are concerned, there was a gradual decay in the Indian handicrafts industry. The reasons were very many. The first reason was that with the coming of the British East India Company and later on with the direct supervision and control of the British Crown, slowly and slowly the princely states which existed in India till that point of time, they were slowly and slowly annexed by the Britishers. They were slowly brought under the British control, which meant that the princely states lost their wealth, lost their financial muscle, economic muscle, and they stopped patronizing the workers involved in handicrafts, the artisans which produce handicrafts. So this was one reason. Up till now, the artisans which were involved in producing these kind of goods, and they were involved in handicrafts, making and producing handicrafts, they enjoyed patronage of their princely courts. So they used to work for the king and they used to get paid in return, and they used to get paid handsomely in return. However, as these princely states, there were so many princely states in India at that point of time, they slowly came under control of the British government and under the control and influence of British East India Company. These princely states were simply unable to continue this patronage, to extend their patronage to these artisans, because of which these artisans lost a regular source of income, and slowly this wreaked havoc on the Indian handicrafts industry. Another reason was there was increasing competition from the British machine-made goods. You know that around 1750s there was industrial revolution which was witnessed in Europe and specifically in Britain. Power looms came into existence. Power looms were invented and they started producing goods on a very large scale. They started mass production. While as far as India was concerned, the goods were still made out of hand, and there was no use of power looms. So naturally, the British machine-made goods were not only produced in large quantities, but they were also relatively of a better quality. And not only this, they were also very cheap when you compare them to Indian handicrafts. And naturally, when the Britishers exerted their influence on India, they expanded their influence in India, they wanted to also sell their goods produced in Britain and they started flooding the Indian markets with the British made goods, which were made of machines. These machine made goods were sold in large quantities because large quantities were being produced, plus since the goods were produced using machines, the goods were relatively cheaper, and this basically drove out the Indian goods from the market, the Indian textiles from the market, the Indian cloth from the market. So because of this, there was a decline in the Indian handicrafts under the colonial rule. Again, we are saying the same thing, that Indian handicrafts were replaced by the British manufactured goods, and there what was seen was called progressive ruralization. Now what do we mean by progressive ruralization? People moving to rural areas from urban centers, from small towns and cities, moving back to rural areas. This is the meaning of progressive ruralization. Why did this happen? This happened because the craftsmen and the artisans who were rendered unemployment because of the decline of the Indian handicraft industry, they were forced to return to their villages, to their ancestral villages and ancestral land. Now they had no source of income. They were not able to sell their products in the market. The princely estates which patronized them were not able to extend that patronage anymore because of the British influence, and then they had competition from the British machine-made goods also, which meant that these artisans were simply not able to earn their livelihood, and so to earn their livelihood they resorted to agriculture, and for that they went back to their ancestral villages. This is the meaning of progressive ruralization, going back to villages to be able to earn some livelihood. So unemployed craftsmen and artisans, they return to the agriculture sector. And you have a look at this piece of statistics. Population dependent on agriculture increased from just 55% of the Indians in 1901 to 72% in 1931. In just 30 years, you see that the population dependent on agriculture had increased by 17%. And this is in the percentage terms. In absolute terms also, because the Indian population was increasing very slowly, of course. In absolute terms also, the number of people who were now dependent on agriculture in 1931 was far more than the number of people dependent on agriculture in 1901. And the reason we have already discussed. Again, when these people started, when these unemployed craftsmen and artisans, they started returning to their villages, naturally they had to purchase land and they had to work on their ancestral land or to purchase land. And slowly, because of this, the agricultural holdings started getting fragmented. See why would agricultural holdings get fragmented? See, for example, earlier there was, let's say, 1 hectare of ancestral land. 2 of the sons were working in the ancestral land, while one son, let's say, was working as an artisan in a nearby town. So the 2 sons which were working in the land, they cultivated half of the land each, which means 1/2 of a hectare was being cultivated by one son and the other half was being cultivated by the other son. But now, when the 3rd son was rendered unemployed because of the decline in the Indian handicrafts industry, when this 3rd son returned to the ancestral land, this meant that the same land was now had to be divided between 3 sons, and the share of every single son was just 1/3 of the total size, or 1/3 of 1 hectare. So this ruralization, progressive ruralization, led to fragmentation of agriculture holdings also. And now again, when these sons, they grow old and they pass on the ancestral land to their offsprings. Let's say every son has 3 sons. So every son now begets 3 sons. So the agriculture holding would have to be further divided among these 3 sons, which meant that there was a progressive fragmentation of the agricultural holdings also, which meant that agriculture soon became unviable, because the smaller the land holding, the more difficult would it be for the farmer to earn a decent living from that particular land, or to earn a decent livelihood from that particular land. So this also impacted the yields, this also impacted the livelihood of the farming community also. Fragmentation led to decreased productivity, and which led to lower earnings for the people engaged in cultivation. Now let us talk in more detail about how agriculture was impacted because of the economic exploitation by the British colonial powers. New land system was introduced. Up till now, see, all the tillers of the land, those who used to till the land, they had got traditional right over land. They were traditionally given rights over land. However, these rights were taken away by the British government, British colonial powers, and land became transferable. What did it mean? It meant that if, let's say, a peasant is not able to pay the revenue, the land revenue, or the lagan, as we call it in the local lingo. So if the peasant is not able to pay the lagans, naturally the land would be confiscated from him and would be given away to somebody else who is capable of paying the lagan, or who is capable of paying the land revenue. Again, the same was the case with the landlords also. The landlords had to collect the land revenue from the peasants, and then they had to deposit it in the coffers of the British government. Again, if the landlords were also not able to deposit the prescribed amount with the British government, their ownership of land was also transferred to some other landlord by way of auctioning the land. So the land became transferable, and this led to a lot of problems. So if the landlord is not able to collect the prescribed amount from the peasants and then deposit it in the exchequer of the government, then the land would be auctioned away to somebody else, to some other landlord. Again, one more issue which was there was that the land revenue was exorbitantly high, which meant that many times the peasants were unable to pay the land revenue, and the peasants had to resort to loans from moneylenders, sahukars, to pay the land revenue. In years of flood or in years of other calamities, they were simply not able to pay the land revenue, and they had to resort to obtaining loans from moneylenders, who used to charge a very high rate of interest. Now this actually created a lot of problems for these peasants, because now they had to not only pay the land revenue every single year on the yield that they have from the land, but also they had to pay a very high rate of interest on the loans that they had taken from the local moneylender or the local sahukar. So basically this led to a debt trap for them, and eventually most of the peasants were unable to pay the loans that they had taken from the money lenders, and eventually they used to get evicted from the land which actually belonged to their ancestors, which was their ancestral land. So this way many of the peasants were actually evicted from their ancestral lands just because they were not able to pay the loan. Many a times the land was confiscated by the money lender who had paid them some money, who had provided them some loan, and many times they were evicted by the landlord just because they were not able to pay the land revenue. Again, commercialization of Indian agriculture was also rampant. Commercialization basically means movement from food crops to cash crops. So more cultivation of cash crops. So why did this commercialization happen? Basically, you know that, and we have discussed it, that in 1750s there was industrial revolution in Britain. They had gradually expanded their industrial sector. There were a lot of machines, a lot of production going on, and the production was relatively more efficient and fast-paced, which meant that the British colonial government needed a lot of raw material to keep its factories running, to keep the machines in the factories running. And this could only happen when they have access to very large supplies of raw material. So what did they do was, they actually started forcing the Indian farmers to shift from food crops to cash crops like cotton, jute, sugarcane, groundnut and indigo. So the farmers were forced to switch from the food crops that they had grown traditionally to cash crops, which were then intended to feed the machines and the factories running back home in Britain. So this led to commercialization of Indian agriculture. This in some sense could have been beneficial for the farmers here in India, because generally cash crops provide you a greater amount of earnings than the food crops. But the problem was, naturally, the British government never paid them a lot of money for their cash crops. The British government never compensated them adequately, compensated the Indian farmers adequately for the cash crops which they supplied to the British government. Plus, the Indian farmers also had to worry about feeding their families, because now earlier they used to grow food crops and they could always consume those food crops in the times of scarcity, but now they had to worry about feeding their own families, because in any case they were not growing food crops anymore, they were only growing cash crops. So on the one hand they were not growing any food crops, so they had to actually go and buy food for themselves and their families from the market. On the other hand, they were also not getting adequately compensated for the cash crops that they were growing. So this was a double whammy for them, and this actually brought so many troubles for many of the farmers, many of the peasants here in India. Now let us talk about the other aspects of the exploitative policies that the Britishers implemented here in India, which was a colony of theirs. Construction of an elaborate railway and irrigation network was undertaken, but again there was no benevolent intention behind this. Railway networks was constructed so that the Britishers could source raw material from the remotest parts of the country, from the rural hinterland of India, and so that the British made goods could be supplied to again the remotest parts of the country. Likewise, irrigation networks was created so that the cash crops that they wanted the Indian farmers to grow could be grown efficiently, and so that the Indian farmers could also achieve high productivity as far as the growth of cash crops is concerned, so that their mills and factories back home in Britain could be kept running. So this was the main objective behind constructing the elaborate railway and irrigation network here in India, but it led to intensification of commercialization of agriculture. More and more agriculture got commercialized. People, farmers, peasants, they started switching from food crops to cash crops. Again, this also led to influx of foreign machine-made goods to India, which wiped out the market for Indian-made goods, and it brought more troubles for the Indian handicrafts industry and the peasants and the artisans working in the Indian handicrafts industry. And then again there was a lot of competition from the Indian handicrafts, which actually wiped out the Indian handicrafts industry. So not only the farmer, not only the peasant community was impacted, but the artisans were also impacted. Again, spread of modern education and scientific thought, it could be understood to be a very good aspect of the British colonial rule, but again the objective of the British colonial government was not as benevolent as it looks like. The objective of the British government in spreading modern education and scientific thought in India was to educate people here, to help them run their administration of the country, to get clerks who could help them run the administration of this particular colony which they had here in India. So they wanted this. But because of this, there was spread of modern education, there was spread of the knowledge of English as a language here in India, and also there was also spread of scientific thought here in India. Again, there was a change in pattern of trade. Up till now, we were exporting the handicrafts also, but now India as a colony became exporter of raw material, and we started importing manufactured items which are basically manufactured in the British factories. So in a way, the trade balance turned unfavorable for India. Up till now, we were exporting a lot of finished goods also, but now we actually started exporting raw materials and we started importing manufactured items from Britain. So the cash crops that the farmers here in India were made to grow, for example, cotton, it used to get exported to the British mills back there in Britain, and then we used to get supplies of the clothes made out of that cotton. So in that sense, it was very detrimental to the Indian economy also. So this was how the British exploited India and how India got exploited under the British colonial rule. In fact, so many intellectuals who of course benefited from the spread of modern education and that got trained in institutes which were opened up by Britishers here in India. So they also studied this pattern of economic exploitation of India, and they criticized British government for this. I have talked about Dadabhai Nehruji, who in fact wrote a treatise. He in fact wrote a book on how the British colonial power was exploiting India. This particular book is known as Poverty and British Rule in India. Poverty and British Rule in India. So it was a very well-researched criticism of the exploitative policies that Britishers were implementing here in India and which were ruining the Indian subcontinent. So friends, now we have understood how the British colonial rule has been exploitative and how it has impacted the Indian subcontinent while we were still a colony of Britain. And now it is time for you to understand that you might be asked these questions. For example, many times these kind of questions might be asked as to how was the construction of a railway network beneficial for the economy of India, and you might be asked to critically appraise the British policies, economic policies here in India. So you will have to be able to provide both the aspects of these policies. Like I mentioned, the railway network, of course, it was good for the economy of India, but the main objective behind that was not to do any good to the Indian economy, but to sell the British-made goods in the remote parts of India and to source raw materials from the remote parts of India. So this kind of critical analysis you may have to do, and you should now be capable of critically analyzing the British colonial rule here in India. Thank you.